We've got major breaking news to bring you now. Developments out of Idaho, where we're learning there appears to be a plea deal for the man accused of killing 4 University of Idaho students in 2022. This is according to an attorney for the family of one of the victims here. Now, we're talking about Bryan Kohberger. You see him here. A court hearing for that change of plea is expected to happen on Wednesday. This is a very big deal, considering how high profile this case has been. Kohberger is accused of stabbing and killing these 4 University of Idaho students, Zana Kernodle, Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Ethan Chapin. Now, Gonsalves' family posting online in just the last couple of minutes just this statement saying, "It's true. We are beyond furious at the state of Idaho. They have failed us." They go on to say, "Please give us some time. This was very unexpected. We appreciate all of your love and support." I want to bring in NBC's Camila Bernal, our legal analyst, Danny Ceballos, who's joining us as well. Camila, let me start with you. We want to be very careful as this is coming in literally the last 90 seconds or so. What do we know and what are we waiting to find out as it relates to what appears to be now a discussion about a plea deal this week for Bryan Kohberger?
Yeah, it appears to be a plea deal, but it's not a done deal yet until the judge says that it is. So we have to be careful in that sense, too, in terms of what happens next with the judge. And I think part of why the family says that they are so angry is because they have been waiting for this trial. They were ready to begin this trial this summer, and they've been fighting over and over again to get accountability here. And I think they were looking forward to this trial this summer. The defense team here, they have been trying to get rid of all of the evidence, essentially, that prosecutors have gathered for this case. The most important being the DNA linking Bryan Kohberger to the scene, because they did find his DNA on the knife sheath. They, of course, also had cell phone records and emails, his Amazon purchases, so much evidence that a lot of it still hasn't even been made public because of that gag order. And of course, everybody was getting ready for that trial this summer. If this does happen and Bryan Kohberger takes this plea deal, we won't be seeing a lot of what the families and a lot of people were looking forward to seeing in court. And so that's why I think the family is upset about all of this. The defense team, they tried to push this trial to happen later because they were saying they just did not have enough time. They had tried to point the finger at someone else, the judge also saying no to that. So it's been a long road to get to where we are today. Remember, the students were killed in November of 2022, and we were getting close to that trial. We'll see what happens this week, but it appears we won't get there, Hallie.
That's right. Jury selection next month, trial in August. Camila, thanks. I'm going to ask you to stand by, but I want to bring in, Danny, before we get to you on the phone, our NBC News legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, who has been covering this case closely for years now. Laura, thank you for being with us. So we keep saying if this is accepted. That is because a judge would have to sign off on this plea deal, right?
That's right. And so the biggest role that a judge has in a case like this, Hallie, is making sure that a defendant like Bryan Kohberger, especially given the stakes for him, that he's doing this knowing and voluntary, that nobody pressured him into it, that his attorney advised him of all of the risks involved in going to trial, and that he made his own independent assessment, of course, with his attorney's help, but that he made his own decision in this case, and it wasn't coerced. And so the judges typically, in almost every jurisdiction, ask him a series of questions to assess that voluntariness and try to suss out whether or not he really understands what he's doing. Now, given the gravity of what he was facing, the death penalty, you can understand why he could say, you know what, looking at all the evidence here, looking at the fact that the judge just refused to accept an alternative perpetrator defense, looking at the fact that the judge has basically denied every single one of the sort of meaty motions that he's filed in recent months trying to, bolster his defense. The judge has basically shot them all down. And so if I'm his defense attorney, I'm laying all of that out for him going into this trial. And so you can understand why he may decide, look, I'm not going to risk the death penalty. What's more interesting is why the state did this now. Given we're just a couple weeks out from trial, given that all that the families have been put through. And I think that's sort of is sort of the context and background for why you might see the Gonsalves family say this is something that they find abhorrent, is just given everything they've been put through now to have the state do this, that might be where they're coming from on that. But again, we're going to have to understand the details. We're going to have to understand, does this, usually with something like this, he doesn't have a right to an appeal. So once he accepts this, it's over. It's done. He can't, then turn around and change his mind in a couple weeks. It would be over, and he would lose his right to do anything to contest it, which means he would be behind bars for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have the death penalty, but there would be no avenue for him. There would be no more relief for him. It would be the end of the road.
Laura, you mentioned that statement that was on the Gonsalves family Facebook page here, in which they are, it appears, incredibly upset at the word that this has come in. Beyond furious is the quote here. In a situation like this, Laura, would the judge take into account any victim opposition here? Is that something that comes into play as the judge is making a decision on this, if in fact the state, the prosecutors had said that they would like to move forward?
So I've seen that when it comes to sentencing. I haven't seen that type of thing come in when it comes to the question of whether or not Bryan Kohberger, his decision to accept such an offer is knowing and voluntary, right? It's a kind of a different question.
I see.
And if the question is coming down to like whether or not this is good for Kohberger, right? Because he's the one that the judge is having to try to protect his rights in this instance. And obviously the family has interest, an enormous interest, but the judge is really interested in making sure that he's done what he can to do to protect Kohberger as the accused in this instance. And so I certainly think that the judge, could say, I'm willing to entertain letters from the family about this, but it's just a different inquiry. And so I think it's going to be less in sort of, top of mind for the judge about how the families are looking at it. But I could see them say, look, I'm happy to hear from the families. I'm happy to, receive letters and hear their side of this. But it really is a sort of an offer and acceptance between a prosecutor and the defendant on this, and not as much of the family. What has always been really unusual in this case, Hallie, is how uninvolved the families have been in almost, again, just top to bottom things like whether the house should be destroyed, right? The house where they were killed was torn down, and the families were upset about that. There was a lot of other sort of back and forth, whether or not they should be, acquiescing to a change of venue, right? There were all these sort of micro moments along the way in this case where the family felt shut out. And so this is just going to be yet another one.
A huge one. And Laura, before, I know we're going to have to let you go off the phone here, but before we do, I think it's worth reminding folks that this has been among the highest profile cases in the country since, 2022, when these murders happened here. It has captivated the attention of people coast to coast here, given the nature of the crime, given the victims, given the circumstances here, Laura.
Yeah, and part of it is just the facts were so sort of breathtakingly awful from the very beginning. It was every parent's worst nightmare to have their kids sent off to college and something like this. I think there was also just so many questions about what was the motivation. We never got an answer as to what happened. And obviously he has maintained his innocence. He has denied any wrongdoing. He pled not guilty, or I should say he stood silent. He didn't actually ever plead. But the point is we never really got a full answer as to what happened. And I think one of the things the trial was going to, at least I hope, answer, and I think many people were hoping would answer, is what really went on there, and why did he allegedly zero in on them? What was it? What was the motivation there? And I think one of the things I'm sure the family is feeling like is they're not going to get as many answers now without having a full trial to assess all of that.
Laura, would a plea deal shine any light on any of that, any of those questions you just laid out, or could it be as simple as like a sentence or two and that's that?
It depends. I've seen it. I've seen it where, sometimes the defendant, after they sort of get the death penalty thing off the table, which is what he's probably most interested in right now, might actually make a statement. And I've seen people apologize. I've seen people sort of, have a completely different tune than they had going into trial. And I've also seen plenty of really tragic cases where the family has absolutely no idea whatever happened.
Wow. Laura Jarrett, we're glad that you scrambled onto the phone for us, given your extensive reporting on this case. Thank you. I know we'll see you later on tonight, tomorrow morning as well. We really appreciate you being with us. Let me go to our NBC News legal analysts now as we're covering these breaking developments. Again, what appears to be a plea deal for the suspect in the University of Idaho murders in 2022. You can see Camila Bernal is with us. We've got Danny Savalos as well. We've got Misty Maris joining us too. Danny, let me go to you here on this because Laura, I think, very cleanly laid out that this is not a done deal yet. And that is important to remind people. It sounds like Wednesday is going to be the day to watch in this case. What could we expect to see go down in court on that day?
Yeah, for criminal defense attorneys, the plea hearing is actually really stressful because you really never know what your client, the defendant, is going to say. And judges vary on the amount of facts they require on the record. We might see a scenario where the judge interrogates Kohberger on what exactly did you do? And you might see Kohberger balk at actually putting those facts on the record. Maybe
Danny, would that be contingent,
like, well,
though? Would he have to answer that question if a judge were to ask on Wednesday? Like, is that something that he would have to answer in order for this process to move forward?
Exactly right. So often what happens if you start interrogating the defendant, that's when they start going off script and maybe trying to massage the facts or give their version. And then the judge says, well, then I can't accept this plea. I don't know that this is going to happen in this case, but it happens all the time. I mean it when I say that plea hearings are actually more stressful for a defense attorney than the actual sentencing hearing, because that's something the lawyers have some control over. But the client, the defendant, can totally blow up the plea hearing if the defendant is unwilling to admit to the specific facts on the record. So I'm very curious to see what this judge will require for a factual basis on the record from the defendant at a plea hearing. And another factor, too, is that the Idaho law and the Idaho Constitution does allow victims, and that includes family members, they have a right to be heard. But that right to be heard cannot trump what the prosecutors ultimately agree to. But they do have a right to be heard. So I'm very curious to see what it is the family is upset about and what degree of communications prosecutors had with the family, because Idaho law and the Idaho Constitution require it.
Danny, stand by for a second. Misty, let me go to you because I know that you have been watching this case closely, and it sounds like, in your view, the defense had basically taken some hits with some of these recent pretrial motions and hearings that we've seen, which may help explain the sort of why now factor. Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So there were a lot of evidentiary decisions that have been happening leading up to this trial. First, there was a lengthy hearing regarding forensic evidence and what would come in, those DNA matches, the DNA that was found on the knife sheath, and the methodology that was used to connect it to Kohberger. The judge said that's all coming in. They also challenged some videotape where a Hyundai Elantra, white Hyundai Elantra, was seen on CCTV, on camera footage that puts him in the area of that house on the night of the murders. The defense said this is not continuous, it can't come in. The judge said it's coming in. And then lastly, the defense wanted to raise some alternate theories. They wanted to say there was an alternate perpetrator. They identified 4 people, the names are under seal, that they said had motive and opportunity to commit this crime. The judge said not enough evidence. And then the other was an alibi defense. They wanted to say, the defense wanted to say that Kohberger was driving around stargazing on the night of the murders. Now, this was to put him in that, have a reason why he was in that area. The judge said no. So all of those were blows to the defense leading up to the trial.
Danny, one of the things we've also talked about is the way that it seems in these various moments over the course of the last couple of years, and Laura laid this out well, the family had been, in their view, somewhat shut out from some of these key and critical decisions. Is that something, like how much in a typical case are family members of victims brought in to some of the machinations for the prosecution, et cetera, as cases move forward?
This case highlights the fact that victims and their family members are not clients of the prosecutors. They are not even parties to the case. But in the modern era, the trend is to increasingly pass legislation that gives these victims, including their families, and specifically including family members under Idaho law, the right to be heard. But the question becomes, what is the right to be heard? It's not the right to control. Victims and their families have never had the right to control the direction of prosecution. So often these statutes just give these victims and their families the opportunity to voice their opinion. But ultimately, the final decision is always with the prosecutor to enter into plea agreements. And then ultimately, the punishment, the sentence, is up to the judge, or in the case of capital punishment, up to the sentencing jury. But although legislation increasingly is giving families of victims more and more rights to be heard, the bottom line is this: they will never be parties. They can never control the direction of the case and the decisions that are made by the state. So when you see that they're angry, it's understandable, because our system has never given them a controlling power in the outcome of a plea deal, a plea offer, or the ultimate sentence.
Let me bring in Dr. Casey Jordan, the forensic psychologist and NBC News contributor, who is joining us now as well. As again, we are in rolling coverage now of these developments coming out of Idaho. News that has stunned, apparently, family members of the victims based on what we are seeing from some of these public statements, as it appears that the suspect in those murders at the University of Idaho in 2022 has now appeared to accept a plea deal that is in the works now. There is a hearing on Wednesday. It is not a done deal yet, we should note. But Dr. Jordan, let me bring you in here on this, because Idaho, and I want you to talk about the context here, does not have an insanity defense, as it's called, right?
Correct. And it's the only state that has the death penalty but does not have the insanity defense. And from the outset, I was very surprised he wasn't pursuing a plea deal, but clearly he wanted to play the long game and, you know, try for all these alternative theories and see if he could get anywhere. I mean, Idaho is not the state to try that, to be honest. So here we are with him finally, if you will, facing the music. I mean, the jig is up if he goes to trial. And I was looking forward to the trial, of course. But you have an eyewitness. You have unbelievable forensic evidence and digital tracing. I mean, I cannot fathom any way he was going to be found anything other than guilty. Yes. And Idaho is a state that would love to apply the death penalty in a case like this. So I understand why the family feels cheated. His only chance was the insanity defense.
Dr. Jordan, there's also, as we've been talking about, this family statement. And so far, again, this is on the Facebook page of the Gonsalves family, saying that they are essentially beyond furious that the state of Idaho, they believe, has failed them. This is a family, and we've seen this from some of the other victims' families as well, that at various critical moments, Dr. Jordan, throughout this case, as this case has developed, when the 911 calls were released, for example, we have seen them release statements publicly. In other words, they seem to understand that the high level of interest in this, in the circumstances around this case, in the horrific nature of the death of their children here. And this appears to also be part and parcel of that now. They were among the first to come out and say, you know, in that statement, alluding to this plea deal that appears to be on the table here.
I understand their concerns, their emotions, their heartbreak at not having what they consider to be their day in court. And they are indirect victims of this crime. The fact that he's willing to take a plea deal, it's only a matter of days or weeks before we can call him the murderer instead of the suspect. And I think they really wanted that process. It's very cathartic for them. But you're right. Some of these families, not all of them, have been involved in documentaries, in making very public statement, and basically using the media as a tool for getting their emotions out there. And in addition to being a criminologist, I'm also a lawyer, and I understand their concerns. But this is the state of Idaho against Bryan Kohberger versus Bryan Kohberger. Yeah. It's not the families. The state of Idaho has to do what's best for all the people of Idaho. And I believe the plea deal is in the best interest of everyone there. They would have gotten a conviction, but is it really worth dragging it out if he was given the death penalty for years and years and years? It's typically 10 to 20 years before somebody who gets the death penalty is actually executed, if they're ever executed. And that gives them a platform and keeps them in the limelight. So I love the idea that this guy's going to go away with 4 sentences, 4 murder convictions, never see the light of day, can never be paroled. I think limiting the amount of exposure he has in the media is one of the best things we can do for his ego.
I should, Dr. Jordan, thank you. That's important context here. I should note that we still don't know a lot of the details of what this plea deal would or would not entail. We expect to find those out in the hours to come. But Danny, as somebody who is in your other job, your day job, a criminal defense attorney, can you help us understand what the conversations may have looked like between the defense team and between Bryan Kohberger here about the possibility of a plea deal being on the table? Is that something that comes up early on in the process, early on as the case has been taken up? Does that only come up once there have been some setbacks for the defense? How does that typically unfold?
I am so fascinated by this issue because it's something, you're absolutely right. It's something that defense attorneys have to deal with throughout a long pretrial process early on. You must communicate to the client the opportunity to take a plea and to consider pleading guilty. And oftentimes at the beginning, the client wants nothing to do with a plea. Now, what's very interesting here is that Kohberger, in the case of public defenders or court-appointed attorneys, the client or the defendant is not losing their own money. So they have maybe an increased incentive to go to trial. You often see in cases where private counsel is being paid, clients and defendants, they run out of money and it makes them rethink a plea. Now, of course, they can only plead guilty if they are in fact guilty, but that finances are often a consideration. That was not a consideration in this case. So maybe someday we'll find out what the tipping point was for Bryan Kohberger. It might have been the loss of the opportunity to delay the trial. It might have been the loss of some of these motions. And I just have to say, as an aside, never have I seen defense attorneys fight so valiantly. They must have filed hundreds of motions. They filed every motion I've ever imagined, and then some I've never even heard of. They fought valiantly. And so I wonder at what point Bryan Kohberger decided, I have changed my mind. I'm going to take a plea, because his attorneys publicly, they didn't just say he's not guilty, we're going to defend him. They didn't give those pat answers. They affirmatively said things like, we believe he is innocent. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, but these defense attorneys fought the good fight. It'll be very interesting if we ever find out why Kohberger changed his mind and when.
I just want to also say, too, and Misty, let me bring you in on this. There is a chance, right? We are providing information here, 6:53 p.m. Eastern, about what we know to be true based on our reporting as we are sourcing it to you from, again, the attorney for one of the family members here, that there appears to be this plea deal. It is potential, Misty, potentially possible that this blows up on Wednesday, right?
Absolutely. That plea hearing, as Danny says, he's absolutely right. That is a stressful day. The judge could ask questions. There's a record that's created. Also, the Kohberger will need to say that he is knowingly and voluntarily entering into this plea deal, that he understands what this means as far as his rights as a defendant, that there's no appellate process. If he does this, he can't appeal the plea or the sentence. So all of that is going to play out on Wednesday, and we may learn more at that hearing. But until it's done, it is not done. So we're just seeing the reporting. This could certainly fall apart in the coming days, or we could get more insight on Wednesday as to what we're really going to hear on the record.
Camila, let me go to you, because you reported from Idaho in the days after this happened. You were, I know, launched up there. You were one of the teams in place, and you talked to a lot of people in and around the community. The intense focus on what had happened, this just shocking set of circumstances, is part of the reason why the defense team wanted a change of venue for this case, right?
It absolutely is. And back in November of 2022, everyone was terrified. It took some time for authorities to hone in on Bryan Kohberger. And when you were in Moscow, Idaho, everybody would be looking at each other to see who would have done this. Everybody was scared of someone they didn't know in town. This is obviously a small college town, and everyone was scared, not just in Moscow, but around the nation, as people learned about this nightmare. Of course, the families have gone through so much. We've gone through a roller coaster. You know, a lot of times we forget that first day when we first reported on all of this, authorities there said there was no foul play. And then the next day, or a few days later, is when they said, actually, yes, it appears that these students were targeted. So it's been a roller coaster of emotions for so many people as they've watched all of this unfold. And of course, when we found out about Bryan Kohberger, everybody sort of breathed a little bit easier, because they knew that there was at least a suspect in this case. The families, we've been talking a lot about the families, and they have gone through so much. You know, I spoke to Steve Gonsalves a few months ago, and he had told me how difficult it was to start getting some of this information as we learned more, as we reported more. He would say, you know, this is like drowning and then coming up for air and then getting pushed back down again. Those were the kinds of things that Steve and the whole family had been talking about. And they really wanted to see this trial because they wanted to know what happened in this case. And if it doesn't happen, there's, of course, going to be still a lot of questions for people who are in Moscow, for people all over the country who wanted to know how this all happened. We've seen small details in terms of the Amazon purchases, in terms of the surveillance video, but there are still so many more questions that a lot of people were hoping to get the answers to during this trial. We'll see what we get. You know, we talked about also Bryan Kohberger not even saying anything during his plea. So it will be interesting to see if he says anything on Wednesday, and we expect him to, likely. But he didn't even want to speak during his plea. It was the judge who entered a not guilty plea on his behalf.
Right.
Of course, he was a student in all of this. He knew what he was doing, in a sense. And so it'll be interesting to see how he handles this one.
There has also been, as we talk about the intense level of interest here, and Danny, I'll go to you on this, when you talk about what happens in the courtroom, what happens in the court of public opinion as well. We've followed a number of the developments, including the judge allowing a roommate to testify. This is the only known eyewitness of the whatever happened that night, of the murders that night, who repeatedly mentioned seeing, and I'm quoting here, bushy eyebrows. This became a real point of contention. I think people will remember at one of these hearings back in the spring. But the judge called that testimony highly relevant because of the fact that this roommate was really the only survivor, the only known person who saw what went down.
The only reason this became an issue, and you're looking at the picture of the alleged bushy eyebrows now, the only reason this became an issue is because Kohberger's defense team fought on every single issue, and they challenged the witness. I've done this before, where you have a witness you don't like, and you think, well, how can I challenge not what they say, but their ability to have seen what they say they've said? So, for example, you show that maybe their vision was blocked, or in this case, that she was clouded, this witness, by her intoxication or the fact that she was tired. And so instead, early on, sometimes you challenge whether the witness really even saw what they said they saw. And that's the only reason we get this sort of debate about bushy eyebrows. And really what the defense was arguing was such an uphill battle. They were saying that, look, this isn't exactly an eyewitness identifying Kohberger. The only thing the witness is saying is that she saw bushy eyebrows. And that's not enough for an identification. She was too tired. She was too intoxicated. She shouldn't even, we're challenging her ability to have even seen this. What an uphill battle. What a long shot motion. And that's the only reason this came out into the ether for us to look at. The reality was the judge made the right call. Something like this is an issue of credibility. The defense is free to cross-examine the witness. Oh, did you see anything in addition to bushy eyebrows? Where were you standing? How much did you have to drink? But that's a trial issue. That's not something that gets knocked out pre-trial. And that's how because of that fight, the defense attorneys fought. That's why the bushy eyebrows even came out as early as they did, instead of as they normally would have at trial through cross-examination.
And just quickly, Danny, given that jury selection was supposed to start in almost literally, I think, a month from today, I want to say July 30th, how far along would the prosecution have been in building this case and preparing for trial to begin in August?
I would assume they were mostly ready by now. Keep in mind, as much as there were filings on this case, both sides filed so many motions. I've never seen so many. There were also so many that were what's called ex parte. They were hidden. They were sealed. We didn't even see most of the motions. Presumably, they'll be unsealed at some point in the future. And we may have a wealth of knowledge about this case that we never imagined. And I expect that to be true. And in fact, one of the judges even remarked that, hey, we're doing too much of this ex parte, sealed, not on the record. And once the case is over, presumably those things will be unsealed and we'll learn a lot more about what the prosecution had. But when you consider that even what was publicly known was so damning, I can't imagine how much more they had. The prosecution was ready to go.
I want to thank all of you, Danny, Misty, Camila, Casey. I'd like you to stand by, though, for just a minute, because we are now ticking across to 7 o'clock Eastern time, 4 p.m. out west, where we have major breaking news. What can only be described as a bombshell apparent plea deal out of Idaho, where the man accused of brutally killing 4 University of Idaho students in 2022 has apparently been offered and has accepted a plea deal, according to an attorney for one of the victims' families. We're talking here about Bryan Kohberger. His trial was highly anticipated, set to begin just about a month from now. in a case that shook the small college town of Moscow, Idaho, shook the country, really, with that trial just weeks away. Kohberger is accused of stabbing and killing Zana Kernodle, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonsalves, and Ethan Chapin. He'd been facing the death penalty. Now, the family of Kaylee Gonsalves on a Facebook family page posting online just as this story was developing this, saying, "It's true. We are beyond furious at the state of Idaho. They have failed us," the statement says. They go on to say, "Please give us some time. This was very unexpected. We appreciate all your love and support." Unexpected indeed, in what is a shocking word of this plea deal with our team following these updates for us. Camila Bernal, Danny Savalos, criminologist Casey Jordan, legal analyst Misty Maris, Laura Jarrett on the phone as well. And you'll see Keith Morrison, too, our Dateline correspondent, who has covered this case closely for years. Keith, thank you for being on with us as we have a number of developments tonight. This apparent plea deal here. You have been following this just, I think, 6 weeks ago. You and Dateline came out with new pieces of information that would likely have been presented at the trial. This video of what appeared to be Kohberger's car driving in the area. How surprising is it to see it take a turn like this? And we should note, it is not a done deal until this hearing on Wednesday when a judge signs off on this.
Exactly right. I mean, you could not be down with a feather, however. The idea that this would be a plea deal is a complete surprise to a lot of people. However, when you look at the evidence that has been assembled, it's pretty significant evidence. It would be a tough case for the defense. It would certainly be a long, arduous trial. And the death penalty was available. I can only assume that the prosecution would have contemplated at least whether or not they made the offer earlier to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for guilty pleas. And perhaps that's simply what happened, that Kohberger may have recognized he can't possibly have prevailed in this case, and that the only answer really was to take a plea, spend the rest of his life in prison. I know that the families would rather have something harsher than that, but at least one of them would. But there it is, and certainly it will speed the process.
You know, you talk about the anger from at least the Gonsalves family, and I should note that at NBC News, we have obviously reached out to everybody involved in this story. These developments are coming in very quickly in just the last maybe 60 minutes or so. But Keith, I know you spoke with, I believe, the mom of somebody who was supposed to be staying over at this particular house on the night of the murder. She was incredibly emotional talking with you on Dateline here, which I think speaks to the way that this story has reverberated around not just Moscow, Idaho, but around the country as well.
Oh, sure it has. I mean, it's a horrifying story, a terrifying tale, really, about the progression of somebody to in a position where he could accomplish that sort of thing, or could even contemplate accomplishing that sort of thing. And we were waiting to see it all play out in the trial. I know the judge was not terribly happy with some of the information we were able to put out there, but the fact was, it was there. The evidence is looking pretty significant. So here we are now. The Idaho Statesman is saying that they have a copy of the letter and that they are confirming that this is what's going to happen, and that there will be a hearing on Wednesday where the deal will be made.
Keith, if you can, and I know how busy you are, I'm going to ask you to stand by for just a second, only because I think this is an important moment to bring in our senior legal correspondent, Laura Jarrett, because as Keith mentions and talks about here, Laura, this case, important to note here that the defense had a series of setbacks, and that when we look ahead to this court hearing on Wednesday, it is the judge who will have to sign off on this ultimately. Would we expect that to happen on Wednesday, Laura? Might that take some time?
It could easily happen on Wednesday. It could be the case that there are filings under seal that we don't know about, Hallie. As you've been, I know, going through this with various guests all evening, there have been a ton of filings recently under seal and even hearings under seal, and we have no idea what happened there. And so it may be that the judge knows more about this than we do, but certainly the judge could be prepared, with a fair, a little bit of notice to ask the the defendant the series of classic questions about making sure that this is voluntary and that this is not coerced, and that he understands, Kohberger would be understanding that he would be waiving his right to an appeal. So he doesn't get to change his mind if he decides to accept this deal and the judge agrees that he's doing it knowing and voluntary and intelligently. There would be no do-overs. It would be done. Now, we can all think of examples where plea deals fell apart. Remember Hunter Biden?
That's right. Hunter Biden came to mind right away. Yeah.
Yeah, so the judge is under an obligation to the defendant in a case to make sure that he understands exactly what rights he's giving up. And you understand why Kohberger, understanding what like he was facing here, why he might make this calculation. What I think a lot of people are puzzled with tonight is why the prosecutors did this. Going into a trial like this, yes, it costs money, it's resources. There's always risks going into a trial, but they had all the leverage, Hallie, going into this. They had had any number of victories with this judge. Once they got a new judge, they kept winning in front of the judge on evidentiary issues. And even before all of that, they went into it with cell phone data. They went into it with surveillance footage. They had a fair amount of circumstantial evidence. They said that they had his DNA at the crime scene, right? So they're going into this with maximum leverage, the prosecutors are. And so why they would decide in the 11th hour with less than 2 months to go until trial, and so they're definitely prepared right now to go to trial, but why they would decide after they've already spent all this money and time over the course of almost 3 years and led the parents to believe that they were going to go to trial, why they would decide now is the time to put this type of offer out on the table and be prepared to accept it if Kohberger goes for it, is the part I think that's going to be baffling to the parents and I think might speak to why we saw that angry statement from them tonight.
Given the fury that emanated from that Facebook page statement from the Gonsalves family, would a judge, Laura, take into consideration victim opposition to a plea deal in a case like this?
He can, and he could say, look, I'm going to slow this down. We're going to hear from the family. They can write me a letter. They can, even get on the stand and talk to me about it. But again, this is really about assessing whether Kohberger is making an intelligent and voluntary and non-coerced choice. It's certainly that the family has an enormous interest here, given what is at stake and what's involved. But it's really a matter of making sure that Kohberger understands his right as the accused, as the defendant, as somebody who has a right to go to trial and make the state prove their case. And so that's what Judge Hippler's primary focus is going to be when he holds that change of plea hearing. Because remember, as of right now, he's on the record saying that he's going to be acquitted at trial, and that his attorney was saying any number of times, even recently, that his position was that he was innocent and that there were alternative possible suspects. The judge just didn't go for any of that. That was part of, a string of losses that he suffered recently. But he will have to go on record saying he is pleading guilty if, in fact, he goes forward with a change of plea. He'll have to go on record with that. And he can make statements. He can apologize. I've seen that plenty of times in court. Or he can do nothing, and he can just accept that he's changing his plea to guilty.
Laura Jarrett, our senior legal correspondent who's been covering this case from the start. Laura, thank you for being with us. Danny, let me go to you, our legal analyst. How much information may we find out once we see some of the documentation around what is this apparent plea deal? Will it be short, couple of sentences? Might it be something more fulsome? The judge may press Bryan Kohberger on some of this too, right?
That's the thing I'm looking for the most. Every judge is different. Some judges just require you to say, I'm pleading to this because I am in fact guilty, and everybody moves on. Some judges start asking a lot of questions. Defense attorneys always prepare their clients that, look, it might be quick, or you might have to answer quite a few questions to establish what's called a factual basis for the plea. And the judge cannot take the plea unless the judge has a factual basis. What that is depends on each individual judge. So it's very possible we might see some more probing questions from the judge on Wednesday to find out what exactly, whether he's entering to this plea voluntarily, whether it's knowing, whether he admits to the specific facts on the record. And look, anything can blow it up. For example, the question that always makes my heart race, Are you satisfied with the representation of your counsel? That makes every lawyer wonder, what's he going to say? Because if he says he's not, then that blows up the plea. If you can't get through the plea colloquy, as it's called, a scripted list of questions, then the plea cannot be taken. And Bryan Kohberger, as we pointed out, is someone who chose to stand mute way back at his arraignment. So will he be up for any theatrics during his plea hearing, his change of plea hearing more specifically? Time will tell.
You're seeing some of the images here of Kohberger in the courtroom at various points over the last couple of years after a case that stunned the country because of the horrific circumstances of these murders. Let me play now that 911 call that had come in the night that it happened. Listen to this.
One of the roommates just passed out, and she was drunk last night, and she's not waking up. Oh, and they saw some man in their house last night. Yeah.
They say they saw some man in their house last night, suspected, of course, to be Bryan Kohberger. Keith Morrison, I want to go to you because Kohberger had apparently been studying criminology, which is one of the threads that had, I think, surprised people when it came out. You, I know, have spoken with people who had met Kohberger before he was charged.
Oh, indeed, yeah. And not only studying criminology, he was a PhD student in criminology whose master's professor said that he was one of the brightest students she ever had. He was a socially awkward young man who had difficulty with making relationships, but seemed to be very interested in getting close to attractive women and kept a lot of pictures of women on his cell phone and just behaved in ways that were considered rather odd. Seemed to like the dark a great deal. But also, I should point out, given what you've been talking about, he has developed, if I may say it this way, it might sound in I don't know whether it sounds right or not, but he has developed a bit of a fan base in jail. And thus one wonders whether or not except not such a terrible thing for him. I know that there are other serial killers who have been spending their lives in prison who have lots of fans, and they get letters all the time. Life isn't as bad in prison as they perhaps thought it might have been.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.